Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a seemingly routine traffic stop. In an IKEA parking lot, no less.
Right. Seems pretty mundane.
Exactly. But what if that stop somehow snowballs? Ends up with a man who has legal protection against deportation being sent back to a country where, his life's potentially in danger.
And not just sent back, but ending up in this notoriously brutal prison. It sparks a whole federal court battle just to try and bring him home.
It really does sound like something out of a thriller, as you said, but it's real life, detailed right here in the sources you've given us for this deep dive.
Yeah, this case really throws a spotlight on the complexities and sometimes, let's face it, the pretty alarming friction points within our immigration and justice systems.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, you've got a stack of documents here. We're looking at court filings, laying out the legal back and forth, and also an excerpt from an AP News report. So our mission really is to cut through the legal jargon, the news snippets, and understand this incredible story. It's about one man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
He was deported from the U.S. even though there was a final court order, a specific one, saying he couldn't be sent back to El Salvador.
So we're going to dive deep into these sources. How could this possibly happen? What's this high-stakes legal fight to get him back all about? And, what does it really tell us about the system itself?
It's definitely a look at one person's experience, but through that lens, you get some surprising insights into how all these layers, the law, enforcement, actions, court oversight, how they're supposed to work.
And maybe what happens when they seem to clash.
Exactly.
So where does this journey begin for Mr. Abrego Garcia? The sources take us way back, right, to his life in El Salvador.
They do. They describe a life lived under constant threat, specifically from the Barrio 18 gang. And this wasn't just, general danger in the area.
Right.
No, the gang was targeting his family directly, demanding rent money from their business.
Yeah.
And the threats got horrifyingly specific.
Specific how? What do the documents say?
Well, they detail how the gang threatened his brother, Caesar, told him it was either death or forced recruitment if the family didn't pay up.
That's chilling.
And even more so when Kilmar himself was just 12 years old, the gang threatened to take him unless his father paid.
12. Just a kid. That's terrifying. How did the family even cope with that kind of constant pressure?
They did everything they could, really. They paid the gang, they moved house multiple times trying to escape. They even had to close their business down.
But it didn't stop.
No, the threats just kept coming, and they escalated. The sources mentioned threats to rape and kill his sisters.
Oh, my God.
Faced with that just inescapable danger, the family made this heartbreaking decision. They sent Caesar and later Kilmar Abrego Garcia to the U.S. just to seek safety.
So he arrives here around 2012, and like many people seeking protection, he ends up in removal proceedings. That's the formal legal process, right? To figure out if someone can stay or has to leave.
Correct. And that process led to a really crucial decision for him back in 2019.
Okay, what happened then?
This is where he gets that legal protection we mentioned. An immigration judge in Baltimore, Maryland, heard his case. The judge looked at the evidence and found that the persecution he and his family faced from Barrio 18 was severe.
And targeted.
Yes, specifically directed at them because they were his family. And under immigration law, that family unit can qualify as a particular social group.
Okay.
So because of that finding, the judge granted him something called withholding of removal. It's under a specific law, INA Section 241b3.
Right. And withholding of removal, what does that actually mean in practice? Is it like asylum?
It's similar in effect, but legally distinct. It's a very powerful form of protection. It means the judge officially determined that his life or his freedom would be threatened if he were sent back to El Salvador.
So it's a direct finding of future danger.
Exactly. And crucially, once that's granted, it legally prohibits the government from removing that individual to that specific country where the danger exists.
Yeah.
El Salvador in his case.
And here's a point the sources really emphasize. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, the agency in charge of immigration enforcement, they did not appeal the judge's decision.
That's absolutely key. The documents confirm it. DHS had their chance to challenge the ruling, to say the judge got it wrong, but they chose not to.
So the decision became final.
Final and binding in November 2019. From that moment on, the U.S. government was legally barred from deporting Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to El Salvador, period.
Okay, so he has this final, unappealed, legally solid order. He can't be sent back to El Salvador. What was his life like here in the U.S. after getting that protection?
Well, according to his wife's affidavit, and she's a U.S. citizen, he'd really built a life here. He was married to her. They have 3 young kids, all U.S. citizens.
Wow.
Yeah. And one of their children has nonverbal autism, needs specialized care. He was working full-time as a sheet metal worker.
Trying to move up.
Definitely. He was enrolled in a 5-year apprenticeship program, even taking classes at the University of Maryland to improve his schools and earn better wages for his family.
And crucially, criminal history.
The sources are very clear. None. No criminal history. He wasn't arrested or accused of any crime leading up to this.
So a stable life, family man, working hard, legally protected from removal to his home country. Then, boom, March 12th, 2025, everything just changes.
It's a sudden, really jarring turn in the story. Detailed in both the AP report excerpt and the court documents, he gets stopped by police in an IKEA parking lot.
What happened during this stop? His wife mentioned something in her statement.
She does. She says he put the officer on speakerphone for her because, he wasn't fully confident with his English. He explained to the officer his son was in the back seat, the child with special needs.
And the officer's response, according to her.
She recounts hearing the officer just take the phone and hang up on her. He was taken into custody, apparently questioned about some past traffic stop, not a crime, a traffic stop. And then he gets transferred through this chain of immigration facilities. First Baltimore, then Louisiana, then down to Texas.
All this despite that 2019 final order, the one saying do not remove to El Salvador.
Yes. Despite that order, the sources state he was, in fact, removed, deported to El Salvador just a few days later, around March 15th, 2025.
How did his wife find out?
She'd gotten a call from him, apparently, saying there were plans to remove him. And then shortly after that, he was just gone.
And this is where that AP News report becomes really chillingly relevant to her account.
Right. She describes seeing these news reports. They were about alleged horrible gang members, supposedly from Venezuela, being sent to El Salvador and locked up in this prison called CCOT.
And she recognized someone.
She recognized her husband. In the news photos, the video footage, by his hand, tattoos, scars on his head, he was shown being held with that group.
And family confirmed it.
Later, yes. His family back in El Salvador confirmed he was detained there, in CCOT. And the sources also mentioned a statement from a Senate staffer, Rubio, confirming he was being held there, basically at the direction of the United States.
Okay, CCOT prison. What did the sources actually say about the conditions there? Because that becomes critical for the legal arguments about harm.
It's central. The plaintiff's court filings, drawing on other reports and expert info, they describe CCOT in, frankly, horrific terms.
Yeah.
A notorious torture chamber.
Really?
That's the language used. Detainees there reportedly face immediate and intentional life-threatening harm from state actors. They're almost never allowed out of their cells. Severely limited food and water.
Oh, man.
Sleeping standing up because it's so overcrowded. No sunlight for days on end. High risk of TB, infections, severe malnutrition. And worryingly, there are reports that inmates basically never leave. Families often get zero information.
And his wife saw something specific.
Her affidavit mentions seeing video footage of her husband actually being dragged by guards inside.
And from the U.S. side, official tracking.
According to the sources, he just vanished from the system, no longer listed in the ICE detainee locator. And his wife, his lawyers, they state they've received absolutely no factual explanation, no legal justification from the government for why he was removed, despite that protection order.
Okay, so this is where the legal fight really kicks into high gear. You've got a final unappealed order saying don't send him back. He gets sent back anyway into these reported conditions. His lawyers had to act fast.
Exactly. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia and others involved filed a lawsuit right against the Secretary of Homeland Security and other government officials, filed it in the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland.
And what were they asking the court to do specifically?
They were asking for emergency relief, a temporary restraining order, or TRO, sometimes called preliminary injunction, basically asking the judge to step in immediately.
To stop further harm.
And compel the government to facilitate and effectuate his return, to bring him back to the United States. Now.
Okay, let's dig into the arguments from Abrego Garcia's side, the plaintiffs. What was their main point in court?
Their core argument was incredibly direct, they said. The government removed him to El Salvador. U.S. law, specifically, that final binding 2019 immigration judge's order clearly, undeniably prohibited them from doing that.
So an illegal act.
They argued it was exactly that, an illegal act of removal done completely outside the proper legal process.
And the sources mentioned this really remarkable moment from the court hearing about that specific claim.
Yeah, this is maybe one of the biggest things jumping out from the documents.
Yeah.
According to the plaintiff's filings, the government's own lawyers essentially conceded the point at the hearing.
Conceded what?
They stated they had nothing to say on the merits and that he should not have been removed to El Salvador.
Wait, hold on. The government admitted in open court that deporting him was wrong.
According to the plaintiff's account of that hearing in these court documents, yes. They conceded the facts about the removal itself being wrongful.
So if they admit it was wrong, what was their argument against bringing him back?
Well, that's where their focus shifted. Their arguments weren't really about whether he should have been removed. They focused almost entirely on whether the judge could legally order them to bring him back.
Okay, so if the government admits the removal was wrong, what did Abrego Garcia's team say about the court's power to fix it, to order his return?
They argued very strongly that federal courts absolutely do have that power. They can order the government to bring back people who've been wrongly removed.
Is there precedent for that?
Yes, they pointed to prior cases where courts have done just that, including, actually, for people deported to El Salvador before. They even noted that the government itself has told the Supreme Court in the past that they perform these kinds of returns as a matter of course.
So it's not impossible.
Their argument was, it's not impossible, the courts can do it, and the government even admits they do it sometimes.
How did they counter the idea that maybe he was removed under some other order we don't know about?
They tackled that head on. They argued he was not removed under any valid executable removal order. The 2019 order specifically forbade sending him to El Salvador.
And the government didn't produce another one?
Critically, no. Abrego Garcia's lawyers pointed out the government produced zero evidence of any other order that would have legally authorized sending him to El Salvador.
What about the government's big argument, jurisdiction, the idea that the court can't act because he wasn't technically in U.S. custody, which is usually needed for habeas corpus?
His lawyers pushed back on that. They argued this isn't just a standard habeas case about current detention. It's fundamentally about the government's illegal action in removing him in the first place.
An action outside the rules.
Exactly. An act, they say, went outside the proper legal framework. They argue that a law the government often relies on, Section 1252G, which limits court review of certain decisions like starting or carrying out removals. Well, they said it didn't apply here.
Why not?
Because they weren't challenging the decision to start proceedings or the general process. They were challenging the specific unlawful act of removal to a prohibited country, something that just shouldn't have happened at all under his existing order.
And obviously the danger he faced in El Salvador, in CICOT, was a huge part of their argument for emergency action.
Absolutely critical. They hammered on the irreparable harm, detailing those documented conditions in CICOT, the risk of torture, beatings, potentially death.
The overcrowding, lack of food.
Right. The lack of basic needs, being cut off from family and lawyers. They argued these conditions were exactly the kind of persecution the immigration judge found he would face back in 2019.
Making the harm immediate and severe.
Yes, arguing it clearly and unequivocally supports a finding of irreparable harm. And that's a key legal standard you need to meet for a court to issue an emergency order like a TRO.
What about the public interest? How did they frame that?
They argued the public interest lies in preventing wrongful removals, especially when someone is being sent to a place where they're likely to face serious harm, like the 2019 order was designed to stop.
And upholding the law.
They argued the public has a strong interest in making sure government agencies follow the rules, follow court orders, especially when the government itself admits it messed up.
Okay, last point for their side. The practical question. Could the government actually get him back from El Salvador? The redressability issue.
Abrego Garcia's team argued, yeah, it was highly likely the government could facilitate his return. They made a big point that the government offered no evidence in court to suggest they couldn't.
They didn't say it's impossible.
No, they were given the chance and apparently offered nothing to prove impossibility. His lawyers even pointed to the judge's own comment in the hearing transcript, where the judge noted this kind of inferred agreement or relationship where the U.S. might even be paying El Salvador to house people.
Suggesting there is leverage or connection.
Suggesting there's likely some channel or mechanism that could be used to facilitate a return.
All right, let's flip to the other side. The U.S. government, the defendants, what were their main arguments against the court ordering his return? Remembering they conceded the removal itself was wrong.
Right, so their arguments focused almost entirely on why the court couldn't or shouldn't order him back. Number one, as you mentioned, was jurisdiction.
Custody issue.
The custody issue, their core point. Habeas corpus, the typical legal route, usually requires the person to be in U.S. custody. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was physically in El Salvador, therefore no jurisdiction.
And how did the judge seem to react to that specific argument based on the transcript?
The transcript suggests the judge really pushed back on this, questioned it heavily, even raised the idea of constructive custody.
Meaning what?
Meaning maybe the U.S. still had enough influence or control or responsibility, especially if they were involved in sending him there, or perhaps even paying for his detention, that it could count as custody for legal purposes.
Interesting. Okay, what was the government's second big argument against ordering his return?
Lack of redressability. This ties into the practical point. They argued a U.S. court simply cannot order a foreign country, El Salvador, to release him.
It's telling another government what to do.
Essentially. They argued that even if the U.S. court ruled in Abrego Garcia's favor, the plaintiffs couldn't definitively prove it was likely that El Salvador would actually comply and let him go. So the court's order wouldn't necessarily fix the injury.
They also brought up that statute again, Section 1252G.
Yes, they doubled down, arguing that this law strips federal courts of jurisdiction over challenges to the execution of removal orders.
Even if the order wasn't executable to that country.
Their position seemed to be that the act of removing him was the execution, and challenging that act falls under the statute's ban on review, regardless of the underlying order's limitations. It's a technical legal argument about the scope of that statute.
Then there was the foreign affairs argument, don't step on the executive branch's turf.
Correct. The government lawyers argued that ordering the executive branch, think State Department, DHS, to go ask a foreign government to release someone would improperly interfere with the president's broad authority over foreign relations.
An area courts tend to stay out of.
Generally, yes. They also threw in a mention that ordering the release of someone potentially tied to gangs could have national security implications.
And this is where that old confidential informant tip comes up again, the one suggesting he was MS-13 from years ago.
Yes. The sources note it was mentioned, referencing the 2019 bond hearing context. But it's really important to stress what the sources also say.
Which is?
That the immigration judge back in 2019 explicitly rejected that specific evidence, found no link between Abrego Garcia and MS-13 or terrorism. And crucially, as we've said, the government lawyers in this current district court hearing conceded the merits. They admitted he shouldn't have been removed to El Salvador.
And they didn't offer evidence.
The government attorney is quoted right in the hearing transcript saying, they made a choice here to produce no evidence against the plaintiff's case, either on the merits or about the impossibility of his return. So while the old tip was mentioned, it wasn't presented as the reason for his current detention or removal.
Okay. So you have these competing arguments. The government admits the removal was wrong, but says the court's hands are tied. Abrego Garcia's team says the court must act to fix an illegal government mistake and prevent horrific harm. How did the U.S. District Court judge rule in the end?
Well, the sources, especially that hearing transcript, they paint a picture of a judge who was really wrestling with this, but also seemed quite skeptical of the government's can't-do-anything position.
Pushing back on jurisdiction and redressability.
Definitely questioning them hard on the jurisdiction claims, and particularly on the complete lack of evidence from the government suggesting they couldn't facilitate his return. The judge seemed unconvinced that the U.S. had zero leverage or means to get him back, especially with that hint of a possible detention arrangement.
So the final decision, the order.
The sources are clear. The U.S. District Court judge ordered the government to facilitate and effectuate Kilmar Abrego Garcia's return to the United States and set a deadline, April 7th, 2025.
Wow. A direct order to bring him back.
Yes, and the transcript captures the judge's sense of urgency. The judge is quoted saying, "I feel like I can't wait on giving my order." The formal written order, which denied the government's request to pause or stay the ruling, was filed just before that deadline, April 6th, 2025.
Okay. What an absolutely extraordinary situation this is. Let's just try to summarize what these sources have shown us. You have one person, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He goes through the whole legal process, gets explicit protection, withholding of removal, a final unappealed order saying he cannot be deported to El Salvador.
Ironclad legal protection, seemingly.
Right. But despite that, he is deported there anyway, ends up reportedly placed with alleged criminals, held in a prison described in horrific terms, a notorious torture chamber.
Which then triggers this urgent federal lawsuit. And in that lawsuit, the government's own lawyers concede the removal itself was wrongful.
But then they argue the court is basically powerless to fix it. They can't order him back because of jurisdiction rules, foreign affairs sensitivities, practical difficulties.
It really lays bare this tension, doesn't it? When different parts of the government machinery seem to collide, you have a final administrative court order from an immigration judge,
versus an enforcement action by the executive branch,
followed by a federal court trying to step in and assert its authority. It pits those hard-won legal protections against these government arguments about its own limitations and prerogatives.
And the sources just fill this legal framework with such sharp, humanizing details. It makes it so real. The specific gang threats driving him out initially.
The life he built here, the U.S. citizen wife and kids, the job, the classes.
The sheer suddenness of that traffic stop turning into deportation. The awful reported conditions in CE cot.
And that pointed back and forth in the courtroom. You can almost hear it in the transcript.
Yeah.
The judge grappling with these huge legal questions with a man's life potentially on the line.
It's definitely more than just a dry legal case. It's a story about the potential human cost when systems designed to protect seem to break down or conflict with each other.
Absolutely.
Which really leaves us and you with a final thought to chew on based on everything we've seen in these sources. What does it really mean for the rule of law, for individual rights, when a final legal protection, something granted after following all the proper procedures, can apparently just be overridden or ignored by other government actions?
And maybe, what is the responsibility of the government itself? What is the power or maybe the duty of the courts when they're faced with having to correct such a fundamental error, especially when someone's safety, maybe even their life, hangs in the balance?